Hanya, as probably you all know, is the author of 2 novels. Her first, The People in the Trees, was published in 2013 and tells of Norton Perina, a doctor who joins an expedition in the 1950s to a Micronesian island, a very distant and unexplored one. There he stumbles upon a lost tribe who appear to have the secret to long life. Perina, though, discovers that that secret is the eating of the flesh of a particular sort of turtle. He steals some and takes it back to America, where he makes his name. But of course, there's much more to it than this, and his eventual fall comes when he's jailed for the sexual abuse of some of the many island children he ends up adopting. I'm not sure how many of you will have read this allegory of colonial exploitation and the abuse of power, but you can actually see it as some sort of duet with her second novel, the remarkable A Little Life, which follows the lives of 4 friends: the artist J.B., architect Malcolm, actor Willem, and lawyer Jude, from when they meet at university until the end of the book. The core of the book, though, is Jude, poor, tortured, and injured Jude, whose backstory of appalling abuse and ill treatment comes to dominate the novel. He holds his story close, though, unwilling to trust anyone, but gradually the whole catalogue of horrors is presented to the reader and to his friends. It's an astonishing and unflinching novel, and not least for the way it divides people. When I read it, I found it deeply affecting, utterly convincing, and my response was almost visceral. When I wasn't reading it, I read it quite quickly, but when I wasn't reading it, Jude was with me all the time, whatever I was doing. It was the most extraordinary thing. And he's stayed with me ever since. And my first reading of the book was about 8 months ago. Yet others I know have been exasperated. They've found it too much, too violent, too over the top, too melodramatic, too extreme, perhaps even too manipulative. What would you say to them?
Well, I guess the polite answer is I'd say that, you know, it's interesting when you write a novel and the people who don't like it accuse it of being excessive, because works, any sort of art should be excessive, or there at least should be pieces that feel extravagant to break through everything else that feels so tame. I mean, what I didn't want with this book was for it to elicit a shrug, for it to be considered boring. And we are in a period of cool fiction, you know, and I mean that in all senses. It tends to be a little bit ironic, it tends to be a little bit distant, it tends to be a little bit cool, it tends to be a little bit cold even. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to have something that was hot in every sense of the word, you know, something that was exaggerated, something that was extreme, something that was almost too much, that, you know, sometimes gleefully crossed the line into bad taste and into an area that is really not reserved for literary fiction. And I think that the form can take that, and I think the form needs that. And I personally didn't want to read another novel that was only okay, that was technically perfect, that had that was clever. And it is sort of one of the defining characteristics of literature of the contemporary age, that it is clever. And this is not a clever book. It's not interested in showing off how more intellectual it is, or how much smarter it is, or how much more sophisticated it is. It's not that kind of book, and it wasn't meant to be that kind of book. And so I do think that there is something willfully out of step about this novel, and how it, especially compared to some dominant American fiction, I'll just say that, and that was purely intentional, yeah. And it's something that some people have been uncomfortable with.
But it is a very clever novel. The way you, firstly, the way it's narrated, your changes of point of view, your changes of tense, the way you gradually bring out what Jude has been through. I mean, it must have been quite a quite a task in terms of its structure.
Well, that's not to say that it's not show-offy, because the book is very show-offy, and you're right, and structure was something I worked on a lot.
Yeah.
And that, too, makes it an old-fashioned book, in the sort of operaticness, I guess, even of its structure, So as you mentioned, it's 7 parts, and within each part, there's 3 subparts, and with each of those subparts, there's 3 other sections. And so I wanted it to feel, I've used this metaphor before, but if you've ever been to China, or to a big city in China, you'll see these enormous glass and steel towers going up, and outside of them there's an exoskeleton of bamboo. And so you'll have these workers, scrabbling up and down and building the future while working with the tools of the past. Yeah. And in much that way, I wanted this book to have a structure that felt springy and pliable, but also strong enough to take everything that was heaped upon it, the excess of emotion, of sentiment, of tragedy, of comedy at times, of love, everything that was going to be, that it was meant to withstand.
So you wanted it to be sort of over the top and elicit these responses. How was it for you, though, writing it?
It was, for me, it was a structural challenge. And once I figured that out, the characters and the voice and the story came very quickly, and they changed very little over the course of the writing. It was, it was glorious, because anyone who creates any sort of art knows that when you can sort of catch the current of creation, it's a wonderful thing, and it happens so rarely, and when it does, you just have to let it go all the way to the end. And it was difficult because it is a book that demands a total surrender to its characters' lives and to the world that has been created.
So, where did Jude come from? I think everyone who loves this book would want to know about Jude. I mean, how did he pop up in your head?
I don't know is the unsatisfying answer. He's someone that, I did want to write a character, and I've talked about this, who never gets better. And when you have, and if we think of most fiction and of most art in general, narrative art, it is about one person's journey from here to here. And what would happen if you had a person who started here and went all the way around and ended up here? What would be the narrative tension of that book? What would be the momentum? And what would be the point in which the reader would figure out, simultaneous to Jude himself, that he wouldn't get better? And how would the reader remain engaged in his life in much the way he has to remain engaged in his life?
It's you give him a tortuous and torturous path. But I gather your editor, Jerry Howard, he described the book as a miserablest epic, I think. And I think when you sent him the manuscript, he wanted you to tone down the violence.
Yes.
Or perhaps not the violence, but the extremities of it all, the extreme events.
He did, and part of this, I think, was, your editor is a reader first and a businessman second, and he was worried about how he was going to market it, which is a legitimate and valid concern. And I think he was, one of the wonderful things about Jerry, I bash him a lot in public, but one of the wonderful things about him, and for any great editor, is any great editor will be able to, is terrifically Catholic in his tastes, and never has a fixed idea of what he likes, and so will read anything, and even into older age will keep redefining what it is that he is responding to in a book. And I think it was interesting for me as an editor myself to see this playing out with Jerry. This his real struggle with the fact that this wasn't the kind of book that he thought he was going to get. He didn't quite know what to do with it. He didn't quite know how he felt about it. He didn't quite know if he liked it. And often when you give something to an editor, that is what you're seeing. You actually don't want someone who's going to say, "I love it, it's brilliant, let's just do it." His discomfort was, I wouldn't say it was clarifying to me, but it was interesting to see, because you don't really know until you have someone read it what effect the book is going to have. And so I think all this is a long way of saying that I think that when he asked me to tone down the violence, it was sort of an initial reaction and not something that he really felt he had an argument for. He didn't know which parts to cut. He wanted me to cut 300 pages from it. He didn't know what parts to, what sections I should lighten. He didn't really have an idea. It was a reaction to the thing of the book, the thing itself, I should say.
So did you end up trimming any of it? Not at all. And you trimmed. I mean, none of the violence, but none of the original manuscript was...
Very little. So the original manuscript was about 960 pages, and I think by the time it went into the process, it was probably about 940.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty good going, isn't it?
Yeah.
For an edit. Reading both The People in the Trees and A Little Life, it does seem to me that you're very interested in the questions of power and abuse. Did it actually grow out of The People in the Trees?
I suppose it's sort of an indirect companion to the book. I mean, the first book is told from the perspective of somebody who is justifying his abuse of power. The second book is something of a response because it is about what happens to someone who has been abused by power. And, I'm not particularly interested in child abuse per se, but I am interested in how it is the greatest abuse of power that one person can visit upon another. You are taking someone who does have a measure of an autonomy. This is an adult, and this adult is taking someone who is physically powerless, is sexually powerless, and most importantly, doesn't even have the language or the emotional sophistication to give voice to what is happening to them, to understand what is being visited upon them. And that is the cruelest thing about this particular form of abuse, because you are playing a very uneven game of chess with someone who is completely unequipped to answer it.
And so was it, The People in the Trees took you, I gather, 18 years to write.
It did.
And A Little Life, 18 months.
Yes.
Was partly The People in the Tree is based on a real character.
It is.
Was that part of the reason why it took you longer to write?
Well,
you think?
I did have to wait for him to die. When I started writing this book, it was 1996, and it is based on a famous scientist named Carleton Gajdusek, who won the Nobel in, I think, 79, I keep forgetting the year, for his discovery of slow-acting prions, which is a disease that, it's a kind of virus that causes scrapie, mad cow, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, and the imaginary disease in this book, and Kuru, which is what this book is based on. And so I did have to wait for him to die. That was number one. Number two, I just, I was very slow. I mean, years went by when I didn't work on it. And number three, I just, when you started writing the book, I was 20, and I think when you're 20, you really, you start fetishizing old age and what you think an old person sounds like. And when I look back at earlier drafts of this book, the language was so florid and so Baroque because you sort of think that, I guess as you become older, you become more pretentious. And as you start keep writing it, you relax into the voice. Yeah. And it was a good lesson, especially when writing about someone who's different than you, in, I suppose, not overthinking or over constructing what that voice might sound like, because ultimately they have to sound like a person and believable and not a character, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. But when you came to write A Little Life, then you have your four main characters, all of whom you give voices in the book and their points of view, and you also have Harold, who is an older man who ends up adopting Jude. Was that therefore more liberating, did you find?
It was because, and this will sound obvious, but at this point, I started writing this book when I was in my late 30s, and you have been, if you are a writer, and if any of you are writers, you've been listening to people speak for years. And you realize that the line between, say, how a 70-year-old speaks and how a 30-year-old speaks, or how an Asian American woman speaks and how, a white American man speaks is actually quite thin in many cases. It's that this idea of language and language being being able to, or people being immediately distinguishable through their language is sometimes true, but sometimes just as often not, especially when you're talking about people in a similar class or in a similar professional field. And so it was just far less intimidating to write someone I didn't know. You know, Harold's a father, he's someone who is older, he's a law professor, and but you start less with the, I guess, markers of difference and identification, and more about who is this person, what are his philosophies about love and about life, how does he think of himself, and it makes the writing of the character, even a character who is wildly different, feel less daunting.
And you write in both books almost exclusively about men, don't you? There's one female character in poor old Esme in the People in the Trees. She doesn't get much of a.
No, she doesn't.
Nobody likes her.
No, no one likes
and
her.
Absolutely not. Yeah. And in a Little Life, really only Julia, I guess. Sophie doesn't. Malcolm's
and Anna.
And Anna, who unfortunately disappears fairly.
Right.
Unfortunately for Jude, disappears fairly quickly. What is it about men and their relationships between them that you find so interesting?
Well, I think, you know, as a writer, it's always a great gift as a novelist to work with a group of people who are restricted or limited in some way, either by law or by society. I don't mean it that way, but by law or by society. No, I actually don't. Who have limitations put upon them, and of language or of feeling or of movement or of physicality or of the way they love. And what you get to do within the space of what they cannot say is often is interesting and liberating, and it really allows you to press up against some boundaries. And so in this book, so much of what the characters repeat is that they can't speak, that they can't say the words, that they don't have the language. And so what do you do when you're a character or a person who is not allowed to say, you know, I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed, I'm vulnerable? Those feelings are human feelings, and so if you're not allowed to say them, how do they come out? How do they express themselves? And they have to express themselves somehow, and they will. And one of the great joys and one of the great challenges is figuring out, for this character who cannot say these words, how do they say it without actually saying it?
And he says it in the end, though, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Do you think?
Yes, but it takes him a long time.
It takes him a very long time, I think. So. And this sort of, I found that the great sort of redeeming element of the book was the love that Jude's friends have for him. I mean, JB is sort of, he can be pretty cruel to Jude. I mean, there's an appalling scene when he does that. I mean, it's a great scene, but when it's appalling when he does that impersonation of him.
Right.
That must have been, while it's cruel, it must have been fantastic to write, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, all the JB scenes were fantastic to write. I mean, he's the character I relate to the most. He gets the best lines, and he's the person, I think, over the course of the book who really changes the most. He's the person who has to work hardest at being good. He's the person who has to really think over the course of his life in this book what it means to be a moral person, what it means to be a good friend, what it means to answer a mistake, what it means to struggle with being kind. And I think that's something that many of us can relate to, and I certainly can. And he is the most human and stabilizing element in a book that is in many ways a fantasy. But in his sections, the book gets closest as it gets to being a contemporary naturalistic book.
Because he does start as, he starts as a sort of narcissist, doesn't he, really, I think?
Well, I think he ends as one as well. But I also was sympathetic to him because he's someone who is having a creative life and struggling with this idea of when you are a creative person or you do identify as an artist, how much monstrousness are you allowed to get away with in the name of art? And I think this book says not much. I hope it's not much.
And I mean, I was also very touched, and I think everybody would have been, by the relationship between Harold and Julia and Jude. I mean, it's a very generous act that Harold and Julia perform when they adopt Jude. But Harold, it's interesting that the people who love him the most are the people who have lost young.
Right.
Willem
Right.
has lost his brother at a young age, and Harold and Julia have lost their son. That's how. Was that a deliberate pairing?
It is deliberate insofar as, I think of the book as two romances. It's a romance between Jude and Willem, and a romance between Jude and Harold. But I think one of the questions I was working through with this book was, one of the questions Jude asks himself once is if Willem is with him because of pity, and then he asks it again. And this idea of, we spend so much time thinking about what is behind love that we have for other people or that other people have for us. Is it because they're attracted to us, or is it because they admire us, or is it because they pity us? And I suppose in Jude's world and in many of our worlds, it doesn't make a difference. I did think that both of them loved him because they pitied him in a sense. But I don't think that love based on pity is any less legitimate than love based on anything else.
And when we're learning about Jude, about his early life and his experiences, you take him from when he's, in effect, he's a foundling, he's sort of dumped on the doorstep.
Right.
And the major part of his early life is, or the abuse, is the chunk with Brother Luke.
Right.
And yet, in a sense, the most physically damaging section is when he's with Dr. Traylor.
Right.
But Dr. Traylor is not really sort of very developed as a character, is he? Those days, weeks, whatever, when he's locked in the basement and wondering how to get out and everything, you don't devote as much of that, and yet it's such a sort of significant part.
That section is brief and it's meant to be quite feverish. And Jude is meant to be a trustworthy and reliable narrator, except about himself. But by the time he gets to Dr. Traylor, I wanted it to feel much more dreamlike than anything else. It perhaps represents the one point in which you wonder, was he going through some sort of split? Was he going through some sort of was he entering some sort of state that got him closer to floating away from the world forever? And the book, that section is I tried to have Jude only notice in the Dr. Traylor section very mundane details. So there's a fixation on the small notes of the physical. What color the pillow was, what books were available on the shelf, what color the living room was, the bud that he sees when he leaves. This idea that when you're in such a state of desperation and panic, that what you look for is the detail that seems the most normal. And so while I didn't doubt that he was, and nor did I want the reader to doubt that he was experiencing what he said he experienced, I did want there to be a sense of a dream to it, that he was floating out of himself, and that those weeks or months seem compressed into something that feels like one long scream.
Right. Yeah. No, I can see that, because it's so as you say, it is incredibly compressed, isn't it? And then he's out there. When you spoke last night at the closing of the Sydney Writers' Festival, and you described the act of reading as an act of psychological reckoning. I wonder what you meant by that.
I mean, I think one of the reasons that we are so unsettled by violence in fiction, that we encounter in fiction, is because, unlike, say, seeing a movie or seeing a painting where the literal act, let's say, is before us, it is someone else's imagining, and we're there to witness it. But when you read something on a page, the writer asks you to participate in creating that image. And what you create draws from your own fears and your own pathologies. And so when you do realize that you're doing this, that you're creating this image in your head, and sometimes this image is something you didn't even know you were capable of producing because it's so dark or it's so disturbing, you can't help but feel a sort of rage at the writer who's led you there. This sense that I have been manipulated into thinking this, and the realization that I have thought this, it must come from within me. And there is this sense that fiction is work. Reading fiction is work in the way that watching a movie is not, because it asks for the reader's full engagement, and it asks for the reader to plunder his or her own psychological dark spaces, I suppose, to go foraging through the mind. And often what the mind retrieves is something very unpleasant indeed.
So it's an active engagement
Yes.
with the book.
And with the subconscious too, which is why I think it can be so upsetting when you realize this is where I assumed this book was going, this is what I'm seeing in it, is this really what I'm seeing in it? It becomes a sort of realization that you, yourself, have become complicit in creating a nightmare.
Oh, I hope I'm not. But so I was slightly surprised then to read that there is talk of a TV series or a film, or is it?
Potentially. There's a couple of offers that are interesting, and I only want to sell it as a limited series, so 8 to 10 hours on a cable or streaming service. And but we'll see. I mean, I want a lot of control over it, so that's why nothing's happened.
So you wouldn't envisage making changes to what is in.
I probably would. The two people I've discussed, the things we've discussed, is really doing a book that isn't a literal translation, but adaptive. So there would probably be wholly different scenes, different dialogue. The characters would remain the same. Thematically, it would remain the same. Tonally, it would remain the same. But there would probably be lots of different dialogue and narrative, actually.
Gosh, it's hard to imagine.
Well, I thought that we should have done it as an animated film. Yeah, you could get away with a lot more, I think.
Now, last year, excuse me, I read two brilliant but very different novels set in New York. One was yours, A Little Life, and the other one was Atticus Lish's Preparations for the Next Life,
which I haven't read.
Yeah, well, they do have you have a couple of things in common. One, trauma, although it's not the same kind of trauma. In Atticus Lish's book, it's the trauma is experienced by an Iraq veteran and an illegal migrant from China. But the other thing is walking. Because in Atticus Lish's book, there's a huge amount of walking. And in A Little Life, there's an awful lot of walking as well.
There is a lot of walking.
And I just wondered, to what extent did you want to write a New York novel?
It's a psychological New York novel. I mean, I didn't want to write a book about, when I was shopping around my first book, I met with an agent, and she said, "What are you working on now?" And I had just started working on this book, and she said, "Oh, you're writing your New York book." And she meant it as sort of approvingly, like this is a rite of passage. If you live in New York, you will write a New York book, and she's right, you probably will. But I wanted to take a place that we know from the popular imagination and present it more as a character study and less as a physical study. So, there's no history in the book, there's no landmarks really in the book, and there's very little, despite all the walking, physical spaces in the book, outside, external physical spaces. Most of the action of this book takes place in rooms, in motel rooms, in studios, in apartments, in offices, and so on and so forth. But what I wanted it to be is a study of what brings people to New York and why they stay. And anyone who I think goes to New York goes there because they're ambitious, and because they're ambitious in a fairly linear way. You want to be at the top of whatever your field is, and that field could be anything. And what being the top means looks very different for different industries and different fields. But you go there because you want to be, you want to prove something to yourself, and you want to to remake yourself. And it is a city that demands that you do both, because if you don't, you might as well get out. It's too unpleasant a place to be. But it's a place where people have always gone to be around people who are smarter than they are, and a place where people have gone to make their own families. And sometimes that means literally people get married or people have children. But often it means that people go to search for a tribe. And it has always been a city where you could live a different kind of adulthood and live a different kind of, and live in a different kind of family, and ever since New York was created. And the other thing is, people have mentioned that this book, that the characters are very successful. And this is the case in New York. New York is a city that fetishizes success. It's a kind of place where you can go to a dinner party and people will whip around the room and tell you what they do and do a little bit of bragging, and that the host of that party will feel proud that he's collected such, such specimens from different worlds. It is a place where people, I think, are constantly measuring how far they've come and reminding themselves, I'm never going to go back to where I came from. And one of the ways you remind yourself is by surrounding yourself with people who you think are going to tether you to a place that you've fought so hard to get to. And so in that sense, it's a story about New York. It's a story about people who, New York attracts a lot of damaged people who are trying to outrun that damage. And they do so by constructing these edifices of identity. And that's, in that way, it's a New York book. But it's not a New York book because it's not about 9/11. It's not about it's not about the Wall Street crisis. It's not about it's not about the AIDS crisis. It's not about the defining moments of contemporary history that we think of New York for.
Yeah, I mean, in the Lish book, when they're out and about walking, I mean, you really get the smells, the sound,
right.
the everything, and there's one absolutely monster walk towards the end, and I found myself looking it up on Google Maps actually to see where the characters were.
Right.
And it was fascinating. Whereas you name the streets,
right.
but you don't actually tell us about what's in the streets.
Right.
It's so in that sense, I can see that. But it's also very much a novel about, as we've touched on, secrets. And when I read it a second time, I mean, I obviously didn't have quite the same sort of shocked response when things happened to Jude. I mean, I remember when the first time, for example, when he encounters Caleb,
right.
Or rather, and my jaw dropped actually at that. But I found myself responding much more to Willem actually the second time. And I mean, the relationship between Willem and Jude is an incredibly tender one, isn't it? But there is this business of secrets, I think. And early on, Willem says that Jude had let him see a little bit more of him, just a little, than he had shown the others, and was unsure what he was supposed to do with that knowledge. So in that friendship, they struggle, don't they, to share this sort of information?
I think they do. I mean, one of the books that I really loved in the past year was Vivian Gornick's Odd Woman in the City, and I think she was just here at the Wheelers about a couple weeks ago. And what she says in that book, it's a book-length essay about being in New York and being older and friendship, is almost completely opposite to what I say about friendship in this book. But she does make this point that this idea that a friend is someone to whom you show your worst self is a relatively recent invention, that for years and years, for centuries, a friend was someone to whom you showed your most virtuous self. You hid the best parts of yourself. And a friend was someone who encouraged you to be better and to whom you wanted to present your best self. And it's, and certainly in the contemporary version of friendship, a true friend, is someone who knows the worst of you and stays by you anyway. In this, and certainly that's the version of friendship that I think I grew up with and most people of my generation grew up with. But this version of friendship that they have is founded on a sense of mystery, and a sense, and we've all experienced this, that it is an honor to try to to try to investigate someone, and that a relationship truly is an ongoing investigation. Now, for some people, it becomes boring, and that sort of mystery quickly loses its appeal. But for Willem and for Jude, I wanted Willem to be somebody who, while not perfect, is comfortable with someone who is reluctant to show everything in an age in which we're encouraged to show everything. And to have the sort of patience to be with a person like that, where in an age when we think that secrets are currency, and that if we don't know our friends' secrets, that it's somehow not a close relationship, and it is something that Willem struggles with, but in the end, he manages to love him anyway.
And the other thing about Willem, he's somebody, I forget the exact phrasing of it, but he says, well, obviously you're gay because you're in a relationship with a man, and he says, no, I'm in a relationship with Jude. And yet the novel has been described by somebody as the great gay novel. How do you react to that?
Well, I haven't read the piece, but I know Garth Greenwell, the writer, a little bit, and he's a wonderful writer and has a very beautiful book out called What Belongs to You. And but I've been told enough about it to know what this story is.
Sure, everybody's
what this
asked
piece
you
is
about
about. And his point is that the book is queer in its aesthetic, that it's melodramatic, that it's operatic, that it's the things that have always defined queer art, from Douglas Sirk to Whitman, are its bigness of life, its sense of melodrama. And I knew he was going to do this story, although I didn't know him at the time. And I actually thought it was a really interesting, unexpected, and a complimentary read of the novel, and one I hadn't expected. And it's been one of the great unexpected honors of this book that it has been embraced by gay readers, and there's been a great generosity of spirit, and especially I'm not a gay man, and to have it have it be read and embraced by some gay male readers has been a great gift, and has been as I said, very, very generous. But having said that, these are all characters who throughout the course of the book really resist categorization and really resent being identified. And I don't think of Willem as gay. I don't think of Jude as gay either. In the 5 years or so since I began writing this book and this book's publication in the States, the conversation that we have in America about gender fluidity, about the sort of capaciousness of sexual orientations and what that means, has changed dramatically and for the better. I mean, there's just been more conversations, there's been more talk about it, there's been a sort of blurring of lines in some circles. And I did want to have two people who are in a relationship and are struggling so hard to make that relationship recognizable. Is it a friendship or is it a sexual relationship? And I hope this book suggests that there's another kind of relationship, that there's a romance, and that anything can be romantic, whether you are in a sexual relationship or whether you are in, let's call it a secular friendship. That romance is sometimes accompanied by sex, but often it's not.
I think one of the most sort of the tenderest moment, almost. Well, it's at the very beginning when Willem just bends down and does up Jude's shoe when they're out and about, and I thought that was quite charming. I mean, it was just gorgeous then, and just a tiny little vignette.
I mean, the book is about expressions of love and expressions of generosity and expressions of tenderness, and it's difficult because all of those things, many of the things that seem remarkable in Willem, are remarkable because he's a man giving it to another man. And if it were a woman being similarly tender or affectionate with another woman, we wouldn't think twice. Because, this idea of, a woman is much more allowed to be much more elastic with her sexuality, and simply much more affectionate. And it is something that is remarkable in men, where this idea of sex and sexuality is so bound up with the idea of maleness and masculinity.
The characters, the four men, there are writers who say that when they finished a book, the characters still live for them, and then there are others who say, oh no, they're completely dead as soon as they finish them. And Nabokov, I think, referred to his characters as galley slaves, and he would have no qualms in doing whatever with them. And in a sense, your character's a galley slave as well, and you're wielding a very harsh whip some of the time. But do the characters live on for you in your head? Do you think about them? Does Jude?
I think they're galley slaves who are revolted. You finish the book, or I finished this book, and I thought, okay, great, this is done, it's time to move on. And it has lingered for much longer than I had thought. And
in what way? In what way does it linger?
You can't, I think, or I couldn't write this book without really exchanging my life for this life. And if the book feels intimate, and if it feels claustrophobic, and if it feels immersive in the way I hope it does, it's because it really became that for me as well. I mean, in terms of pure physical hours, I spent more time with these people for the 18 months it took to write them than I did with, my friends. And because they are your creations and you love them, and you even love the awful ones, it's not as simple as conjuring them up and then asking them to leave. They sort of leave when they want to leave, and so far they haven't.
Tell me, I'm glad to hear that, actually. Tell me then about loving the awful ones. Which of the awful ones do you...
Well, I really enjoyed creating Caleb because he was someone I felt, he's the sort of person who smells damage on other people and is wolfish and is probably the only sort of person who could have broken through to Jude in a relationship sense. But to me, he was someone, and I hope that he is to the reader as well, who I hope you can sense that there are more aspects to him than what appears on the page. And I thought of him as someone who had a great deal of charm and a great deal of intelligence and ferocity, and knew how to move through the world, and was deeply damaged himself in a certain way, but who had a sort of clever and kind of monstrous appeal, and was someone who went on to have a perfectly good life after Jude, who did find love, who did have a life for himself, who is perhaps, what Jude's greatest fear is that it wasn't that Caleb was a horrible person, it was that he inspired Caleb to be a horrible person. And I hope that that's suggested in the book, that he isn't a horrible person wholly. He is someone who is perhaps a bully, and bullied him in the worst way, but wasn't only a bully. He was someone who has a sister who loves him, and who has nieces and nephews who love him, and is capable of showing real love, but not to Jude.
The other thing I would love to have seen the apartment, and the house that they build, which sounds just wonderful. I'd even like to have seen Lisbonard Street. And I'd really like to have seen JB's paintings.
Yeah,
Really?
I had a very clear sense of what JB's paintings. Believe me, a lot of time in the past year has been spent trying to trick various people into making floor plans, into making paintings, into making architectural renderings, and I think we're getting close to doing that just for my own jollies. But yes, I loved, I have a great I'm fascinated by visual artists because they speak two languages. They speak the language of the vernacular. They speak, English or French or Japanese or whatever. And then they have a completely different way of seeing the world. And it's miraculous to me. If I were taking a picture, I would probably take some sort of, I would take some picture of the most mundane details of this place. But a real artist can look at the world and see something that is unseeable. And I find that quality fascinating. And it's something that, for all of JB's unpleasant qualities, it's something that I admired in him, this idea that he had access to a different way of looking at the world. And yeah, I would love someone to do paintings based on his
You don't know
paintings.
anybody who could.
I mean, no.
It'd be great.
Working
wouldn't
on it, yeah.
It would be terrific. Now, what about we lift up the lights, possibly?
I read the book about 6 months ago, so I can't remember his name, but the doctor that treats Jude, that
Andy.
relationship is just so tender and beautiful, and he's so giving, that wonderful physician. So where did that idea come from in that relationship?
Thank you. I mean, well, my father's a doctor, although it's not based on him. And his big complaint with Andy was that, Andy's an orthopedic surgeon, and my father said, orthopedic surgeons don't know how to do anything but cut people open. They don't know anything about biology. They don't know anything about, about disease. All they want to do is cut people open. But I did have this idea that Jude was someone who inspired, as maddening and manipulative and frustrating a character as he is one of those people, and I think many of us know these types of people, who inspire people to want to try to fix him. And the difficulty that Andy faces is that when you're a physician, if there's someone who doesn't want to be saved, you can't save them. And there's nothing you can do. And it's almost impossible. But I wanted someone who really had a sense of Jude's body before anybody else does, and who was able to see him literally at his most vulnerable, and was able to do so with some objectivity and with some distance. And in many ways, this is a relationship that is probably the elemental one in Jude's life.
There's a questioner over there.
Hi, thanks for writing the book. I found it amazing, and I actually could relate to quite a lot of what was happening there. Now, Jason already asked you if you had based any of the characters on anything, and you said, no, I don't know where Jude came from. Well, I would like to say that I would like to ask, I actually, sorry to say, but I don't believe...
It was a good save, yeah.
I don't believe that you don't know where he came from. I'm sorry to say. And that the reason why I came here tonight is that I thought to myself, what sort of a person writes that book? Where does that come from? And so I was wondering, because you haven't actually told us anything about yourself, although it's been fabulous what you have told us. I would like to know if you are able to at all give us some idea if you have something of your life so that we can see where this has come from.
That was sort of a master class in question asking,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
yeah.
I like that. That was very good. He really didn't come from anywhere. Listen, every author leaves part of herself in every character. I will say that. But he certainly wasn't based on anyone I know, and he wasn't based on anyone real. This is such an unsatisfying answer, but he really did come to me, and it was really just a sense of refining him. And once I had him down, he was very, very easy to write because his logic remains completely consistent all the way through the book. And he's somebody who never is unable to really change fundamentally how he thinks about himself. And wasn't that a nice dodge from having to tell you anything about myself?
That's a great gift, though. You must have thought, when you had Jude, must have thought, it's fantastic.
Well, I thought so, and I liked spending time with him. But he is a maddening character, and he is deeply frustrating, and he is exasperating in a lot of ways.
There's a question up there.
The book is very visceral and very descriptive, particularly medically. My best friend's a psychologist, and she backed that up, saying stuff she'd heard. So mine's a pragmatic question, like, where did you research? What did you read? Because to get what you did on paper so graphically, and stuff with Caleb, like that physical abuse as well, not just the medicinal, with Jude. Yeah, how'd you get there? How'd you get that on paper?
I didn't research anything about child abuse, about trauma, or about psychology. I did research their jobs, and one of the great things about writing fiction, you can ask anyone about their jobs, and they will tell you, and they'll often tell you brilliantly. And so, I talked to some people behind the camera for Willem, and if any of you are actors, I'll have you know that people behind the camera hate you, and it was pretty intense. And a good friend of mine is a DP, and had some stories. And I talked to some doctors, obviously, for Andy and for Jude's illnesses. And I talked to some architects. And then I talked to someone at every stage of Jude's career. His career is so important to him. It's the place where it not only appeals to his sense of logic and his sense of how he sees the world, but it also appeals to the sense that when he's at his job, he can be somebody else, and that the rest of his life is incidental. So I talked to law students, I talked to someone in public service law, I talked to some corporate lawyers, and then I talked to a law professor, and then at the end, a law professor went through and read everything. But I didn't talk to anyone about abuse or about psychology, because it all seemed to really make sense. If you're a child who has been, abused, there's so few ways you have to counter that abuse, and so few answers that you have, that you will do whatever, you'll use whatever you have at your disposal. And Jude has a bag of razors, and that's it. And the things he really needs in order to become better, a sense of anger and a sense of entitlement and a sense of rage, he doesn't really get until it's too late.
Any more? There's you've got somebody up there. Yeah. No? There's a questioner down here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering, there's this wonderful, almost atemporal quality to A Little Life, which it seems to sort of just exist. I mean, people send letters, and there's not much reference to modern technology, and especially with People in the Trees being so set in its time.
Right.
I was wondering, was that an artistic choice or part of marketability, or?
Yeah, it was an artistic choice, and this book is completely stripped of history. If you there's some clues about when it's set, that will only be discernible to a very few people. I mean, in the first section, they're at a party at one of JB's colleagues' apartments, and the parents have a certain kind of art collection. This is very inside baseball, but I thought, if you were an art collector in the early 2000s, this is what you would be collecting. And you were but if you didn't know that, then it shouldn't really bother you. But the sorts of ways they talk, the sorts of how they talk about, my editor said at one point, "Who talks like this?" And my best friend said, "People who went to a liberal arts college in the 90s. So there's that kind of language too, about heteronormativity and on and on and on. But mostly I wanted it to feel suspended in time. I wanted it to feel like a fairy tale. And one of the ways that you can make a book feel that you can leave the reader feeling untethered is by taking time out of it altogether. Because then the reader never knows really what's going on other than the internal emotional life of these characters. They can never say they're acting like this because it's 9/11, or isn't Jude worried because the stock market crash has just happened, or anything like that. You are completely trapped within, and this is actually an Instagram term, but within the walled garden of these people's lives. And there's no other escape. And so it feels immersive, and it also should feel slightly constrictive, because you're in this place, you can't get out of it, and there's nowhere else you can look for sort of relief. Thank you.
Question up there.
Hanya, it's fantastic to hear you speak today. It's
thank
been
you.
really enlightening. But I wanted to ask, people are drawn to New York because of success, but often they end up the waiters, wannabe actors, working in a small firm as an architect, never quite making it. How would this book have been different if they all had have just struggled?
Well, again, it's another, someone asked me this, and it would all be about health insurance, I think, because most of the book would be spent, with Jude trying to find proper insurance. But the book is about, the book's a fairy tale, and one of the fairy tale elements of the book is that they are wildly successful, and this does happen to friend groups in New York, which is, again, what was part of what makes New York so annoying, that, that people who are successful start only hanging out with other people who are successful, because it's a way of reassuring yourself. And I didn't want this book to be about struggling in New York. It's about other struggles, but the finances of being in New York is not one of them.
Over here.
Hi.
Hi.
Firstly, congratulations on writing such an amazing, astonishing
thank you.
book. It was just absolutely incredible. One of the things that I found so amazing about it was that it was so seamless, and all of the questions, sort of, the way that you drew out, for the reader, what Jude's story and what had happened to Jude. The only piece of the puzzle that was missing for me was after the accident, who found Jude and how did he get to the hospital? and that is the only bit of the story that was missing for me. And I'm wondering, in your mind, how did Jude get to the hospital, and why did you leave that out?
Well,
That's a very good question.
That's a really good question. I left it out for the reasons that Jason was asking me about earlier. Because, are you carrying a baby? It's a great event for a baby. Yeah. But thank you. But because there is a sense of there's a dissociative quality to that section, where he just, the details that you want to know are not the details he's going to give you. He doesn't, there is a point, I think, and the point is when he gets hit by the car, that he just stops, that he just shuts down and shuts off. And so, as a reader, you want to find out more about the actual, the logic of what happened, and he just isn't in a place to tell it, and never will be, even in his rememberings. But the way I thought about it was that he just got very lucky and there was a car driving by. Yeah, but I just thought, like, oh God, I'm not going to really describe this. Because you do want it to feel suspended and mysterious.
There's a question over there, Hanya.
Hi, Hanya. Thanks
Hi.
so much for coming and speaking with us. I've really enjoyed listening
thank
to you
you.
speak. I just wanted to ask you a question. You said that it took you 18 months to write this book, and I was just interested in knowing what actually came to you first. Was it the characters? Was it the narrative? Was it the ending? Was it Jude?
It was probably the characters, the tone, how I knew it would get darker, and it would slowly. I wanted something that, I thought of it as a piece of ombre cloth. Do you know what that is? It's a kind of dyeing method in which it starts off very, very light, and then it gets darker and darker and darker. And so I wanted to have that kind of effect. So I knew I wanted to do that, and then the last lines, and then the action of it came quite quickly. I knew how I was going to roughly get from here to here, but it didn't change hugely. What changed was some specifics about Jude's job. He was originally going to be at a hedge fund for various reasons and a lawyer there, and then it just didn't really work. But and then there were some scenes that got cut out, and some sort of minor plot points. But it pretty much, once I had the last lines, I was able to sort of backfill everything else.
One more question. I think we only have time for one more. Yep, over here.
I found obviously one of the happiest parts of the book was the relationship with Willem and Jude. And so when Willem died, it was really heartbreaking and seemed really cruel to Jude and to the reader. Like,
Big spoiler there.
Was that something that was always planned, or was that a hard decision to make it that extra level of dark?
It was always planned, but it was very hard to write, and I almost backed out of it. Yeah.
Since we've, can I just say, with that scene, I was was quite touched by Willem's last thoughts. I won't tell you what they were, but
right.
But that's I found that very moving. Can we squeeze in one more question? There's a lady down here, I think, or maybe two more questions because there's somebody there as well. Oh no, you're putting on your coat. Sorry. It's a good job it's not an auction.
I know.
You might have bought something.
I was intrigued in the writing that you wrote so beautifully and about men, but as a woman, how did you invest sort of female qualities or things about female friendship in how their male friendships worked?
I don't think so. I mean, I feel that male friendships, I mean, it's an exaggeration of male friendship, but I do feel male friendships have their own language and their own limits and their own boundaries. And this is a particularly close group of male friends who are perhaps more enlightened than men we typically see, I think, in popular culture. But I did want there to really be a sense that there were lines that they couldn't cross with one another until they do.
Oh, quickly.
It's a very obvious question and what everyone probably wants to ask. When's the next one?
Oh, well, probably not for a while. I just don't have anything else to say, really. And I just believe that you should only write it when it feels like you have to write it. Otherwise, you just end up with a boring book. And right now, I don't really have anything else to say.
All right. Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we'll probably.
Thank you so much.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.